Hi, this is Travis Shaw with the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area, here with my coworker, Director of Education, Anne-Marie Kirileson. And today we are celebrating George Washington's birthday by exploring some of the locations here in our heritage area that have a connection to our nation's first president. We always like to joke that George Washington slept here. Well, here in the Virginia Piedmont, there are several locations that have very deep ties to Washington. Washington would spend much of his younger days out here in the heritage area as a surveyor, as a young soldier, and was a frequent guest both as a general and president. And so we are going to take a short journey through the heritage area, explore some of these locations, and we're going to begin right here in the village of White Post.
That's right. So White Post famously has its beginnings as a crossroads marker, and you can see that ubiquitous White Post behind us here. According to local history, a white post has been here for a couple hundred years now, and the point of the post was to point towards Greenway Court, which was the country seat of America's only resident peer, Thomas Fairfax, the 6th Lord Fairfax of Cameron. And a lot of George Washington's experiences here are tied with Lord Fairfax's experience here while he was taking proprietorship of his ancestral land grant, which he had inherited through his mother's side, the Culpepers, in support of the English crown. So when Thomas Fairfax decides to really take a stronger hand in his property is incidentally the same year that George Washington is born, 1732, when Fairfax finds out just how much money there is to be made out here selling land and also collecting quit rents. So he's going to assign a cousin of his, Colonel William Fairfax, to help administer his property, and that's when Fairfax is going to start coming out to this area in the 1730s and 1740s to find out just how many acres are in this land grant between the Potomac River and the Rappahannock River. Eventually it settled on a figure of about 5 million acres, but in order to support that claim in Parliament, Fairfax is going to need a survey done more accurately representing, these areas. Now, as part of this adventure in surveying all of these lands, it takes, a couple of decades to get a good reckoning done. He ends up in 1748 hiring, among others, established surveyors, James Genn and others, a very young George Washington. Now, the Washingtons and the Fairfaxes were becoming closer. We know, of course, that Lawrence Fairfax is responsible for a lot of the career development of George, and one of the reasons Lawrence is able to help George out is Lawrence very fortunately marries Anne Fairfax, who is the daughter of Colonel William Fairfax, who's administrating Lord Fairfax's land grant. So it's this connection with the Fairfax family that helps George Washington not only create those social connections, which he is going to be able to take advantage of throughout his life and form a community and family around him, but also making a lot of professional connections. We know that George didn't attend a university. The heritage area becomes kind of his university. He's going to learn things he needs to know. He's going to learn a trade, and he's going to meet people who he is going to be able to work with and use from a perspective of military benefit, of political benefit throughout his career and in the early nation. So near here, 1748, of course, we know that George Washington is going to be surveying this area. By 1752, Lord Fairfax has established himself at Greenway Court, which is really a hunting lodge kind of a space. It's not a grand manor. Lord Fairfax sees himself as a country gentleman, and that's another aspect which George, I think, learns from Lord Fairfax, is how to be this country gentleman. He goes riding with the Fairfaxes very often, fox hunting, and really is taken under the wing of Lord Fairfax, to the extent that during the French and Indian War, of course, not only does Lord Fairfax maintain a correspondence with George Washington, George will ask him for money during the war when he, at one point in 1755, he's lost 3 horses and needs a mount, and who can he write to? Fairfax is just about the closest resource that he has to being in the frontier west of Fredericktown, west of, modern day Winchester. We also know, of course, that Fairfax is responsible for the Frederick County Militia, which George Washington is going to attempt to call out a couple of times during the French and Indian War. And he's also serving as a justice of the peace. So there are many professional benefits to being friends with the Fairfaxes, which will also result in George Washington being elected to the House of Burgesses. Again, with Fairfax's help, George will represent Frederick County and also Fairfax County, thanks in large part to Thomas Fairfax. Now, they do maintain a correspondence. George even writes to Lord Fairfax during the Revolutionary War to help settle a land dispute. And we know that even after the war, George thought well, of this landed peer who stayed in America even through the Revolution and afterwards, and who passed away in 1781. And George was always very deferential to this individual, and I think he understood just how much Fairfax had, helped give him a leg up and made him the man that he was.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely impossible to understate the importance of that connection to Fairfax. Fairfax is a mentor. He is
right.
the figure that shapes Washington, and so much of that early relationship is going to play out right here in White Post. This is an intersection that Washington would have crossed many, many times on his way to and from Greenway Court. Now, unfortunately, Greenway Court no longer stands. One of the kind of outlying buildings, an old office.
Yep, the land office.
The land office still exists to this day. It is on private property, so unfortunately you cannot go and visit Greenway Court, but you can, as you pass through the village of White Post, think back to that time over 200 years ago when Washington would have been a frequent visitor. Now, I'm glad you mentioned the French and Indian War, because in some of our later stops, we're going to talk about Washington's early military experience, as well as a few other surveying connections that he has out here. So we hope you'll join us at our next stop.